There is a truth so radical that even when heard repeatedly, the mind finds ways to escape it. This truth shakes every foundation of how reality has been understood for centuries. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this truth is not suggested gently or proposed as theory. It is declared with absolute conviction. Consciousness is the only reality, and every human being carries within the creative power that ancient scriptures called divine. What most seek outside themselves, what most pray to in distant heavens, exists as the core of their own being. Yet even when this is spoken plainly, doubt lingers. Why? The world has taught separation so effectively that awakening feels like rebellion. From early childhood, external authority has been established as the source of truth and power. Parents, teachers, institutions, religions, all of them, often with good intentions, reinforce the idea that something outside determines what happens inside. This conditioning runs so deep that even when someone encounters teachings about consciousness creating reality, the first response is often resistance. The mind says, "This cannot be true. I am just human. I am limited. I am small." But what if that voice itself is the only limitation? Consider how many times someone has felt powerless while simultaneously creating the exact experience of powerlessness. This is not philosophical wordplay. This is the mechanics of manifestation operating without awareness. Every thought assumed as true, every feeling repeated consistently, every internal narrative believed without question, these shape what appears as external reality. Neville Goddard taught this with crystalline clarity through his principle of assumption. To assume is to accept something as true before evidence appears. And consciousness, by its very nature, creates evidence to match whatever is assumed. So the person who assumes they are separate from divine power will experience that separation as their reality. The person who assumes they are powerless will encounter circumstances that confirm it. But what happens when the assumption changes? There is a moment in every spiritual journey where intellectual understanding is not enough. The mind can agree with concepts, study ancient wisdom, repeat affirmations, and still remain unchanged. Why? Because transformation does not occur in the realm of thought alone. It occurs when consciousness shifts at the level of identity. This is the core of what Neville called feeling the wish fulfilled, not as emotional excitement, but as the deep inner knowing that what is desired is already true in consciousness. When someone finally accepts that they are not a limited human seeking divine connection but divine consciousness expressing through human form, everything rearranges. Reality bends. Circumstances shift. What seemed impossible becomes natural. Is there still doubt? The question in this title is not rhetorical. It is an invitation to examine what lies beneath every prayer, every manifestation attempt, every moment of searching. If the truth has been heard before, that consciousness is God, that imagination creates reality, that the I am within is the creative power of the universe, then why does doubt persist? Perhaps because accepting this truth means accepting total responsibility. It means no more blaming circumstances, other people, past trauma, or bad luck. It means recognizing that every experience, without exception, originates from the state of consciousness held as identity. That is a weight most are not prepared to carry. Yet it is also the key to absolute freedom. The one who doubts their divinity will live as a beggar. The one who assumes it will live as royalty. Which assumption feels true right now? The mechanics of consciousness are simpler than most believe, yet more profound than most dare to accept. Every single experience begins as an assumption within awareness. Before anything manifests physically, it exists as a state of consciousness. This is not mysticism, this is the foundation of creation itself. When someone says, "I am tired, I am broke, I am unworthy," they are not describing reality. They are creating it. The I am is the name of the creative power, the same power that ancient texts attributed to the divine. Every statement that follows those two words becomes a command to consciousness, and consciousness, being infinitely obedient, produces matching circumstances. How many times has someone unknowingly commanded their own suffering? Dr. Joe Dispenza has demonstrated through neuroscience that the brain does not distinguish between an imagined experience and a physical one. When someone vividly imagines a desired outcome with emotional intensity, the brain fires the same neural pathways as if the event were actually happening. This rewiring of the brain changes biology, which changes behavior, which changes reality. Neville Goddard taught this decades before modern science confirmed it. In the lessons learned from his works, imagination is not fantasy or escape, it is the workshop of creation. To imagine something with a feeling of its reality already present is to plant a seed in consciousness that must, by law, grow into physical form. Yet most people use imagination to replay past pain or project future fear. What would shift if imagination were used deliberately? There is a mirror analogy that reveals everything. A mirror does not argue with what stands before it. It does not question, delay, or judge. It simply reflects. Consciousness operates the same way. It reflects back the dominant assumptions held within it. The person who stands before the mirror and hates their reflection does not blame the mirror. They understand that to change the reflection, they must change themselves. Yet when it comes to life circumstances, most people stare at unwanted reflections and demand the mirror change first. They wait for money to feel abundant. They wait for love to feel worthy. They wait for success to feel confident. But the mirror of consciousness cannot work that way. The internal state must shift first. The reflection has no choice but to follow. This is where the concept of living from the end becomes transformative. Most people live from their current circumstances, reacting to what already exists. They see lack and feel lack. They see limitation and assume limitation. They see closed doors and believe doors are closed. But Neville taught that the awakened consciousness does the opposite. It starts from the desired end, the wish fulfilled, and lives as though it is already true. Not as pretense, but as assumption. Not as hope, but as knowing. When someone genuinely assumes the state of the wish fulfilled, their thoughts change. Their words change. Their actions change. And because consciousness creates reality, the outer world rearranges itself to match the inner assumption. How long has someone been waiting for external change while refusing to change internally? The majority of humanity lives in a trance of victimhood. They believe they are subject to forces beyond their control: economy, government, other people's opinions, genetic limitations, past mistakes. And because they believe this, they experience it as truth. But belief is just repeated assumption. What has been assumed can be unassumed. What has been accepted can be rejected. The person who finally understands that they are not a body with consciousness, but consciousness with a body, steps out of victimhood entirely. They realize that every condition, every circumstance, every relationship is a reflection of the state they have been occupying in consciousness. And if consciousness created the current reality, consciousness can create a different one. The power has never been outside. It has always been within, waiting to be recognized and directed. Is that recognition happening now, or is doubt still ruling? The greatest resistance to this truth does not come from lack of information. It comes from identity. Most people have built their entire sense of self around being separate, limited, and dependent on external conditions. To accept that consciousness is divine means dismantling that identity completely. It means letting go of the victim story, the struggle narrative, the belief that life happens to them instead of through them. This terrifies the conditioned mind because without those stories, who would they be? But this is precisely the point. The false self, the one constructed from past experiences, societal programming, and repeated thoughts, must dissolve for the true self to emerge. And the true self is not small, not limited, not powerless. It is the creative consciousness that sources all existence. When Neville Goddard spoke of the law of assumption, he was not offering a technique. He was revealing the fundamental principle by which reality operates. Assumption is not positive thinking or wishful hoping. It is the act of occupying a state of consciousness as though it were already fact. To assume wealth is not to pretend to have money. It is to embody the internal state of someone for whom wealth is natural and effortless. To assume health is not to deny symptoms. It is to dwell in the consciousness of wholeness regardless of what the body currently displays. The assumption, when maintained consistently, becomes the blueprint from which physical reality is constructed. How many people have been assuming the opposite of what they desire and wondering why manifestation fails? There is a biological truth that supports this spiritual principle. Bruce Lipton's research in epigenetics revealed that genes do not control destiny, consciousness does. The environment surrounding a cell, determined by the signals sent from the brain, dictates which genes activate and which remain dormant. A person living in chronic stress sends signals that activate survival genes and suppress growth genes. A person living in peace and coherence sends signals that activate healing, regeneration, and thriving. And what determines those signals? The state of consciousness, the thoughts believed, the feelings repeated, the identity assumed. So even at the cellular level, consciousness is acting as God, directing, creating, transforming. The body obeys the consciousness inhabiting it. What commands has the body been receiving? Consider the difference between these two lives. One person wakes each day reacting to circumstances. They check their bank account and feel anxiety. They scroll through news and absorb fear. They interact with others and take on their energy. They go to sleep rehearsing problems and wondering when things will change. This person is living as though consciousness is passive, as though they are a leaf blown by external winds. But another person wakes and consciously chooses their state. Before checking anything external, they settle into the feeling of the wish fulfilled. They imagine from the end. They speak as though their desire is already done. They move through the day from that assumption, and when contradictory evidence appears, they do not waver. They understand that the outer world is always reflecting yesterday's consciousness, and today's assumption is creating tomorrow's reality. Which of these two lives reflects the recognition of divinity within? The teachings are consistent across centuries, expressed in different languages but pointing to the same truth. Ancient scriptures, mystical traditions, quantum physics, and modern neuroscience all converge on one point: consciousness precedes form. What is held in awareness with conviction becomes experience. This is not reserved for saints, gurus, or the spiritually advanced. This is the operating system of existence itself, available to anyone willing to accept it. Yet doubt persists, not because the teaching is unclear, but because accepting it demands everything. It demands the end of complaining, the end of blaming, the end of waiting for external rescue. It demands the full ownership of one's creative power. And with that ownership comes both the burden and the glory of being God in human form. Is someone ready to stop doubting and start assuming? There is a passage in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 12, that has been read countless times yet rarely understood in its full revolutionary power. The words declare, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do." Most interpret this as a distant promise, a spiritual metaphor, or something reserved for exceptional beings. But when examined through the lens of the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, the verse reveals something far more immediate and personal. The me is not an external figure to worship. It is the I am consciousness within every human being. To believe in that consciousness is to recognize it as the creative power. And the works, the miracles, the manifestations, the transformations, are not granted by an outside force. They are the natural result of consciousness knowing itself as divine. Break down the phrase, "whoever believes in me." Belief here is not intellectual agreement or religious faith. It is the complete assumption of identity with the divine creative principle. When someone truly believes in the I am within them, they stop seeking power externally. They stop praying to a distant God and start speaking from the God consciousness they embody. This shift from beggar to creator is the entire transformation. The phrase, "will also do the works that I do," confirms that the same creative capacity demonstrated in ancient miracles exists within every individual. Not as potential, but as present reality. Healing, provision, transformation, all of these emerge when consciousness assumes the state of their fulfillment. And the final phrase, "greater works than these will he do," is the ultimate validation. The awakened human, operating consciously as creative power, surpasses even the greatest demonstrations of the past. Why? Because conscious creation is limitless when doubt is removed. How many people have read this verse and felt unworthy? How many have believed it applied to someone else, someone holier, someone more spiritually advanced? This is the wound that religion often creates, the separation between the human and the divine. But Neville Goddard taught that this separation is the only illusion. In truth, there is no gap. There is only consciousness expressing at different levels of awareness. The person who suffers does not lack divine power. They have simply assumed a state of powerlessness and are experiencing the manifestation of that assumption. The person who thrives has assumed a state of wholeness and abundance. Same creative force. Different assumption. The verse is not a promise for the future. It is a description of how consciousness works right now. This understanding brings both relief and responsibility. Relief, because it means no one is broken, cursed, or forsaken. Every condition can shift because every condition is rooted in assumption. Responsibility, because it means no external savior is coming to fix what only internal transformation can change. The pain someone has carried, the rejection, the loss, the failure, the illness, these are not punishments or random misfortunes. They are reflections of states of consciousness that were occupied, often unconsciously. This does not mean blame. It means possibility. If consciousness created the unwanted, consciousness can create the desired. The same power that manifested suffering can manifest freedom. But only when the assumption changes. Only when someone stops identifying as victim and starts identifying as creator. The awakened individual does not wait for permission to do the works. They do not wait for worthiness, for perfect circumstances, for external validation. They assume the state of the wish fulfilled and live from that end. They imagine the desired reality with such conviction that it becomes more real than present conditions. And because consciousness is the only reality, the physical world rearranges to reflect the inner assumption. This is not metaphor. This is mechanics. The verse in John is not inspiring poetry, it is operational instruction. Believe in the I am. Assume the state. Do the works. Not someday. Not when conditions improve. From this moment. From the recognition that divinity is not something to attain but something to accept as the truth of what has always been. Is that acceptance finally occurring, or is there still hesitation? When consciousness awakens to its own divinity, reality does not simply improve, it fundamentally transforms. The person who once begged for change begins to command it. The person who once hoped for miracles begins to create them. This is not arrogance or delusion. This is the natural result of operating from truth instead of illusion. Every limitation that seemed fixed reveals itself as flexible. Every door that seemed closed opens. Every relationship, circumstance, and condition becomes workable because consciousness recognizes itself as the source, not the subject. The shift is not gradual for everyone. For some, it happens in an instant, a moment of complete recognition where the old identity collapses and the true self emerges fully empowered. What would change in someone's life if they stopped waiting and started assuming? Responsibility becomes sacred when understood correctly. It does not mean blaming oneself for past suffering. It means reclaiming the creative power that was always present but unrecognized. Consider someone who has struggled financially for years. They have worked hard, tried strategies, followed advice, yet lack persists. From the victim perspective, this is proof of bad luck or external blocks. But from the awakened perspective, it is simply evidence of an assumption held in consciousness, an assumption of scarcity, unworthiness, or struggle. The moment that assumption is dropped and replaced with the assumption of natural abundance, the external world must shift. Not because circumstances change on their own, but because consciousness, now operating from a different state, attracts different opportunities, makes different decisions, radiates different energy. The person changes. Reality follows. How long has someone been blaming the mirror instead of changing what stands before it? There are countless examples of this principle in action, though most go unrecognized. The person who assumed they would meet their ideal partner and then encountered them in the most unexpected way. The person who assumed complete healing and watched their body recover against all medical predictions. The person who assumed career success and found doors opening that logic could not explain. These are not coincidences or luck. These are demonstrations of the law of assumption operating precisely as Neville Goddard taught. Every fulfilled desire began as an assumption held with conviction. Every manifestation started as an internal state maintained despite external contradiction. The world did not give them what they wanted. Consciousness created the experience they assumed as true. And what one person has done, anyone can do, because the power is not personal, it is universal. It is the I am expressing through every aware being. The teaching becomes more radical when applied to circumstances that seem irreversible. What about the relationship that ended badly? What about the opportunity that was missed? What about the diagnosis that feels final? From the limited perspective, these are fixed realities. But from the consciousness that knows itself as creative power, nothing is final until it is assumed as final. Neville taught revision, the practice of going back to an undesirable event in imagination and rewriting it as desired. Not as fantasy, but as a shift in the vibrational signature held in consciousness. When the past is revised internally with feeling and conviction, the present reflects that revision. Former enemies reconcile. Lost opportunities return in new forms. Health reverses. This sounds impossible to the rational mind. But the rational mind operates from the assumption that time is linear and the past is unchangeable. Consciousness operates from a dimension where all time is now, and what is assumed in imagination becomes fact in experience. Who decides what is possible? The preparation for deliberate creation is not complex. It does not require rituals, tools, or years of spiritual practice. It requires one thing: the willingness to assume the desired state as already true and persist in that assumption regardless of what the senses report. This is the entire teaching. When someone wants health, they do not beg for it or worry about its absence. They assume the state of perfect health. They imagine from that end. They think, speak, and feel as someone who is completely whole. When someone wants love, they do not seek it desperately or feel incomplete without it. They assume the state of being deeply loved. They dwell in that feeling. They live from it. And because consciousness creates reality, the assumption externalizes. The wish fulfilled in imagination becomes the fact experienced in the world. This is not magic. This is law. The law that governs all creation, available to anyone willing to stop doubting and start assuming. Is someone ready to occupy the state they have been seeking? The existential weight of this truth cannot be overstated. To recognize oneself as God in human form is to stand at the edge of everything previously believed and step into a reality where nothing is as it seemed. It is the death of the small self and the birth of the infinite self. Every complaint, every excuse, every story of limitation, all of it collapses when consciousness awakens to its own nature. What remains is pure creative potential, unbounded and waiting to be directed. This is why so many resist the teaching even when it resonates deeply. To accept it fully means accepting that every experience, every relationship, every condition has been a reflection of internal states. It means owning the suffering as much as the joy. And yet, this ownership is not burden, it is liberation. Because if consciousness created the unwanted, consciousness holds the power to create the desired. The key has always been within. Imagine consciousness as an ocean. Every individual experience is a wave rising from that ocean, appearing separate for a moment, then returning to the whole. The wave believes it is distinct, isolated, subject to forces beyond its control. It fears other waves, envies larger ones, and dreads the moment it will crash and disappear. But all of this is illusion. The wave is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean temporarily expressing in wave form. When the wave recognizes this, fear dissolves. There is no death, because the wave was never separate. There is no lack, because the entire ocean is its source. There is no powerlessness, because the same force that creates hurricanes and tides flows through it. This is the truth of human consciousness. The individual experience is not separate from the infinite creative power. It is that power, focused into a particular form, exploring itself through experience. The body, the mind, and the spirit are not three separate things working independently. They are one unified system responding to consciousness. When consciousness assumes a state, the mind generates corresponding thoughts. The thoughts trigger emotions. The emotions send signals to the body. The body responds with chemistry, posture, energy, and action. And the actions create results that match the original assumption. This is the loop of creation operating continuously, whether someone is aware of it or not. Most people let the loop run unconsciously, reacting to circumstances and reinforcing the same states over and over. But the awakened individual interrupts the loop deliberately. They choose the state. They direct the thoughts. They cultivate the feeling. They command the body. And the results shift accordingly. This is not control. It is alignment. Alignment with the truth of what consciousness is and how it operates. There is a call happening in this very moment, not from an external voice but from the depth of being itself. It is the call to stop living as though life happens by chance or external forces. It is the call to assume the state of the wish fulfilled and persist in it until manifestation occurs. It is the call to stop identifying with past pain, current limitations, or future fears, and instead identify with the I Am, the timeless, limitless, creative consciousness that sources all things. This call does not require perfection. It does not require flawless faith or spiritual mastery. It requires only the willingness to assume differently and persist in that assumption. The person who does this, who genuinely occupies the state of their desire as though it were already fact, becomes unstoppable. Not because they force reality to bend, but because reality naturally reflects the consciousness they embody. The transition from understanding to application is where most people stall. They hear the teaching, agree with it intellectually, feel inspired momentarily, and then return to habitual patterns of thought and assumption. But inspiration without application is entertainment, not transformation. The teaching is complete. The principle is clear. Consciousness creates reality through assumption. To change reality, change the assumption. To change the assumption, occupy the desired state in imagination with feeling until it becomes natural. This is the practice. This is the path. And it begins not tomorrow, not when circumstances improve, not when doubt disappears. It begins now, in this moment, with a decision to assume the truth of divinity instead of the lie of limitation. What state is being assumed right now, and is it the state of the wish fulfilled? There is a practice that brings all of this understanding into lived experience. It is simple, requiring no special tools or external conditions, yet it holds the power to shift consciousness permanently when done with full conviction. The practice is this: before sleep tonight, when the body is relaxed and the mind is quiet, let imagination construct a scene that implies the wish has already been fulfilled. Not a scene of wanting or hoping, but a scene of having. If the desire is health, imagine a friend congratulating on complete recovery. If the desire is abundance, imagine checking a bank statement and feeling deep satisfaction. If the desire is love, imagine the feeling of being cherished. The scene should be brief, sensory, and repeated until it feels natural. As the scene loops in imagination, let the feeling of its reality saturate consciousness. Fall asleep in that state. Let it be the last thing held in awareness before drifting into rest. This impresses the subconscious, and the subconscious, being one with the creative power of consciousness, begins the work of externalizing what has been assumed. This practice is not visualization for the sake of distraction. It is deliberate assumption. It is the act of dwelling in the end, feeling the wish fulfilled, and allowing consciousness to reorganize reality from that state. Neville Goddard called this sleeping in the wish fulfilled, and he taught it as the most powerful method for manifestation. Why? Because the moments before sleep are when the conscious mind releases control and the subconscious becomes most receptive. What is impressed upon consciousness in that sacred window takes root deeply. The person who falls asleep feeling lack will wake to circumstances that reflect lack. The person who falls asleep feeling fulfillment will wake to circumstances that reflect fulfillment. The practice is simple. The results are inevitable. And repetition is key. One night of assuming the desired state may plant the seed. Consistent nights of assuming it will cause the seed to grow, break through the soil of current conditions, and manifest as lived experience. For those who feel the resonance of this teaching and want to continue receiving content that supports this awakening, subscribing to this channel and activating the notification bell ensures that each new message reaches them when it is shared. This is not about algorithms or numbers. It is about connection, being part of a community that recognizes consciousness as creative power and supports one another in living from that truth. Every person who engages with this content, who leaves a comment sharing their own insights or breakthroughs, who shares these teachings with someone who needs them, is participating in a collective shift. The awakening of one consciousness ripples through the whole. The manifestation of one person inspires the faith of another. This is how transformation spreads, not through force, but through resonance. Now the final question emerges, not as conclusion but as beginning. If it is true that consciousness is God, and God is the creative power of all existence, and every human being is consciousness in form, then what assumption will be held from this moment forward? Will it be the assumption of limitation, the belief that life happens by chance, the identity of someone waiting for external rescue? Or will it be the assumption of divinity, the recognition that the I am within is the same I am that created galaxies, that consciousness is the only reality, and that whatever is assumed with conviction must, by law, become experience? The choice is not theoretical. It is immediate. It is happening now. And the life that unfolds from this point forward will be the perfect reflection of whichever assumption is chosen. So choose consciously. Choose powerfully. Choose as the God in human form that has always been present, waiting only to be recognized and directed. The teaching is complete, yet the journey is eternal. Because consciousness, once awakened to its own divinity, does not stop growing, creating, or expressing. Every desire fulfilled opens the door to deeper desires. Every manifestation proves the principle and invites greater demonstrations. Every assumption made consciously strengthens the capacity to assume even more powerfully. This is not the end of seeking, it is the beginning of creating. Not from lack, but from fullness. Not from desperation, but from knowing. Not as a limited human begging for scraps from an external God, but as infinite consciousness delighting in its own creative ability. The truth has been spoken. The principle has been revealed. The power has been recognized. What remains is only this, the decision to stop doubting and start assuming. Because the one who assumes their divinity lives as divinity. And the one who lives as divinity experiences reality as the perfect mirror of that assumption, limitless, responsive, and infinitely creative. The doubt can end now. The assumption can begin. And everything changes from there.